Hello again. This is a lecture on regime types. So, political scientists classify regimes into types like democratic or communist in order to compare them better. In particular, we would like to know whether certain kinds of outcomes that we observe in the world can be attributed to the kind of regime that a country adopts. The idea is quite simply that similar types of regimes function in similar ways and therefore structure certain kinds of social, political, or economic outcomes in similar ways. And when we know that a certain kind of regime has a certain type of effect in the world, we can better argue about which regime ultimately our country should adopt. The worry, of course, is that if we classify regimes wrongly, that is to say, if we call a country a democracy that's not a democracy, or if we call a communist regime modernizing authoritarian, or vice versa, that we will make a mistake in our studies, and we will really attribute the causal effects of one regime to another regime. In other words, it'll make our cross-national comparisons invalid when we misclassify regimes, and so it's important to be able to get the labels right, even though at the end of the day it is an argument about labels. Now, again, this is another exercise in typology. Typology doesn't explain anything yet. It just simply organizes our thoughts. It's a way of structuring the world, mentally speaking. It's a model, right? It's a map, you might say, that represents the world and classifies the world into different neighborhoods, not based on their geography, but based on their regime type. Now, every so often, a new regime will be discovered, and by that we simply mean it will be found useful to distinguish between two different subtypes within a regime type, like two different kinds of democracies, or many different kinds of authoritarianism that have been proposed. And scholars still argue about whether it's better to group regimes under sort of a larger tent and having more variation within regime type, or to disaggregate regimes into subtypes. But note that every time you disaggregate it into a subtype, you could presumably disaggregate it further to the point where you're just saying, well, every regime is unique. But if you say that every regime is unique, which is in some sense true, you are giving up on the notion of comparison, or the notion of being able to explain anything through a country's regime type. Okay, so a little bit more conceptual work. Regime, states, and governments. Now, regimes kind of stand in between states and governments until their levels of abstraction. Regime type is more permanent than a government. A government, remember, is the equivalent of an American administration. Governments come and go, but regimes are much more stable. But regimes are a little bit less stable than states. States stick around for longer periods of time than regimes. Regimes, at the most abstract level, are sets of institutions that determine how power will be distributed within a state. And remember, institutions are sets of rules. So, sets of rules about how power is going to be distributed within a state. How much power will the legislative branch have? How much power will the executive branch have? Will there be judicial review on the part of judges or not? And if so, how does the judicial review structured? Is it before legislation passes, after legislation passes? Again, regime types broadly have similar types of rules about all these sorts of things. The quick and dirty way that I tend to look at regimes is I tend to look at them as constitutions. So when constitutions are fundamentally reformed or changed, the regime tends to change. And constitution, really, if you think about it, is a set of rules about the rules. Right? The U.S. Constitution says how rules will be made by society. So how will the legislature legislate? What process will be undertaken for law to become law? So constitutions are the rules about the rules. And when the rules about the rules change enough, I think it's pretty safe to say that the regime type has changed. So when Russia became the USSR in 1917, the regime type clearly changed from a monarchy to a communist dictatorship, and when the USSR crumbled in 1991 back into Russia, the regime type changed again to a kind of democracy. And now today, arguably, the regime type has evolved into something else. Okay, now it's important because we are so label focused and it's so easy to hide things as much as clarify things through the use of vocabulary and terminology. It's worth noting that we often confuse ideology and regime type, but it's important for us to keep them distinct, right? Political ideology is a set of ideas that attempts to justify power relationships, including regime types, whereas regime types are simply sets of rules, sets of institutions for allocating political power to different offices in society. The ambiguity arises in the cases, and particularly in communism, where communism is clearly an ideology, but it's also a regime type, and the regime type and the ideology may be at odds with one another at times. For instance, if we say that North Korea is a communist regime, it's not clear if we are making a claim about the way it allocates political power in a communist sort of way, or the ideology that it uses to justify its policies, including its methods of allocating political power. Right? You see the ambiguity there, where a regime may claim to be communist, and use communism as an ideology to justify its exercise of political power, but on the other hand, the way it actually allocates power is not consistent with what most people would term communist ideology. And the same is going to be true for democracy, fascism, and so on and so forth, whereby countries often these days call themselves democracies, but in reality do not use particularly democratic means for allocating most political offices. Okay, so social scientists, it's important to be clear what we mean. The problem is that it's very easy to get bogged down into regime types and into ideology. There's a lot at stake riding on whether we label a country a democracy or not. I mean, you'd think that labels don't matter, but at some level, labels have power in the world, and to be able to call oneself democratic is often a source of pride, particularly for emerging countries around the world. And if scholars start denying a country the status of democratic because of this or that feature that they lack or that they have, then they're going to get upset. But of course, the job of social scientists is not to keep every politician happy, but it's to try to coherently be able to distinguish things that are different. And when the German Democratic Republic, otherwise known as East Germany, called itself democratic, a lot of people, particularly social scientists, were not willing to classify it as democracy in their cross-national studies, whereas West Germany was classified as a democracy, even though it didn't call itself a democracy in its official name. Okay, so with all of this said, I'm going to nonetheless attempt to transmit some of the consensus to you guys about what the different sorts of major regime types are and their accompanying ideologies. But it's worth noting that all these regimes are going to be ideal types. Real-world examples are going to depart more or less from these ideal types, and some of these are controversial. I mean, I'm going to try to pick fairly clear cases, but again, a lot of progress in establishing knowledge in political science is held back by debates about what counts as a democracy, or what counts and how we should define that, or what counts as a communist regime and how we should define that. So one last note, and I'll save the rest for another video, but what drives political ideology is going to be a debate that we can't settle here in this course. But I want you to note the difference of emphasis between your textbook and the authors of The Dictator's Handbook, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith. Drogas and Orvis say that political ideologies provide some, but not infinite, wiggle room in the choice of political structures. That is to say, there's only so much that you can do before you have to stop calling yourself a democracy or a communist regime. You can only go so far. You can only twist the basic tenets of an ideology so far before nobody believes, that you are in fact what you say you are. And that's a fairly plausible view. But Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith have a different view, and their view is that at the end of the day, political ideologies really are simply vehicles of propaganda that suit convenient political arrangements. So more or less any arrangement, people use whatever materials are out there to justify their rule. And so at the end of the day, political ideology really isn't much of a constraint on what kinds of structures people in power can adopt or put into place, because perhaps because at the end of the day, most of the public is relatively unsophisticated about these issues, and so are unlikely to raise much of a protest if the leader wants to call a particular set of arrangements one label versus another. Okay, so hang tight for the next lecture, where I'm going to go through different regime types and give you some examples.